Retro gaming is really popular nowadays. It's fueled by a lot of nostalgia. It's a trip down memory lane for a lot of people. A return to a simpler time. My earliest video game memory would be playing Tecmo Bowl on the original Nintendo NES at my cousin's house. He had got it for Christmas, and I was hooked. For a lot of people, they like to see these things that they haven't seen in a very long time. People just browsing through the store and saying, oh, I remember that, and I remember how much time we used to spend playing that game. It's really enjoyable to see the happiness on people's face whenever they see these things. The Magnavox Odyssey, I've never even seen one in person. Games have came a long way since the early days when it was just squares on a screen. They were simplistic by today's standards, but it had to start somewhere. Retro gaming is alive and well. Just because they're old doesn't mean they're not good. And a lot of people put their heart and soul into these games that pave the way for modern gaming, and it deserves to be appreciated.
Before Nintendo and Atari, before pixels danced across screens in arcades and bedrooms, before gaming was a multi-billion-dollar empire, it began in silence. No sound effects, no colors, no memory. Just a blip on a screen, a plastic overlay, and your imagination. But this was not simplicity. This was a revolution. Every joystick you've held, every world you've saved, every button-mashing frenzy, every game over screen, they all trace their bloodline back to the Magnavox Odyssey.
My name's Keith Stevens. I'm the video game manager here at Play to Win Games. As the manager of video games, I just kind of take trade-ins, restore and work on game consoles that come in that need it. Also do repairs for customers. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Magnavox Odyssey. That goes all the way back to 1968. Ralph Baer, he was a engineer. He created in 1968 what was called the brown box.
A 1, a 2, a 3, and down I go.
Ralph Baer was from New Hampshire. He worked for Sanders Associates, and they had government contracts. He was working on a simulator on an oscilloscope for the military, and of course they were not very interested, but he was. And he found a way to make these fun games on an oscilloscope. And so later, the brown box became that platform.
It got the name brown box because around that time, everything was wood grain. If it wasn't wood grain, it wasn't high quality. Don't know why that is. I don't think anyone does.
It's very rudimentary. These are prototypes. But you can see that the brown box was a stepping stone towards the first home video game console.
Okay, who else would like to play? Why don't you come on and play the game?
He went and talked to the TV manufacturers, and one after another said, no, I don't know what this is. What is it?
Then he had brought this to Magnavox and was like, hey, you know, I think this, you know, we could actually have something here. And they weren't really interested at first, but one of the games that was on there was kind of like ping pong in a way. And when they played that and they saw that, they were like, okay, this we could sell.
And Magnavox got into looking at how to use TVs besides just looking at it. You can look at your TV. You can listen to your TV. Lo and behold, you could play games on your TV. My name is George Collins. I'm president of the Magnavox Historical Preservation Association based in Greenville, Tennessee. Magnavox itself started in Napa, California in 1911, and they were formed as the Commercial Wireless and Development Company. The company evolved. They moved offices to Oakland, California. Then they decided to move to Chicago initially, and just months later, they ended up in Fort Wayne.
I'm actually sitting in the former Magnavox headquarters. It's 1700 Magnavox Way. And it is very unusual to be sitting at the birthplace of the video game industry. This is where the contracts were signed. This is where the intentions of building that first video game system happened.
For an entire year, the prototype of the world's first home gaming console, fondly dubbed Skill-O-Vision, was quietly tested among focus groups. However, the name failed to ring home with those who tried it. So, the heir to Bear's beloved brown box was reborn under the new name, Odyssey.
It wasn't much longer after that Philips purchased Magnavox, and they said, hey, Fort Wayne's great, we'll leave the tech center here, but you know what? We want to move the headquarters closer to manufacturing, so that's when they left and went down to Tennessee.
They wanted to get back into consumer products, and so they went looking for a place where they could have labor, access to resources, close to distribution. On an exploratory trip to Hot Springs, they ended up visiting Greenville, Tennessee. You had development in the 50s and 60s of other plants. You had Johnson City, Tennessee, Morristown, Jefferson City. Odyssey was made in Jefferson City. Some components were made in Morristown as well, but Jefferson City.
The new home video game system brought upwards of 700 jobs to East Tennessee. The Magnavox Odyssey was in full production by August of 1972.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, the electronic game of the future.
So when you bought the wonderful Magnavox Odyssey in 1972, boy did you get a lot of stuff. You could go skiing, you could play football, you could explore a haunted house. Now, all of this is if you have a very active imagination. So the way it would work is you would have a cellophane overlay that went over your TV. They made them for both 18-inch up to 25-inch. Let's say tennis or ping pong. It would be green, so it looks like it's green. You'd have two characters on there. The characters themselves wouldn't move, but the squares would move back and forth. And it just kind of gave it more of a feel that you're playing a color video game. This is a sub hunt, and if you want to see how you would do this, you would turn the knobs and go along this really twisty, windy, crazy path. Saying it has cartridges is kind of giving it a lot of credit, unfortunately. Technically, all of the games are pretty much baked into the console itself. Each cartridge, I'll get a little technical here, each cartridge has 44 pins on it, and depending on which pins are jumped or shorted together, that activates which part of the game or the console itself that comes up on the TV. So if I pull this out, the system itself will actually turn off because these two pins right here are actually made together, so it turns it on. There was no sounds, there was no scorekeeping, it was as simple could be. When the Odyssey came out, it could only be sold inside of Magnavox retailers. Terrible idea on their part, mainly because, well, it wasn't advertised very well, and unless you were going in there to buy a new TV or radio, you weren't going to learn about this thing. So what they did was they had this nice little molded case here that you would have your Odyssey in, your overlays would go in here, your cards and everything would go in here, and you'd close it up, but you would have a door-to-door salesman going around trying to sell you on the idea of a video game.
Famed solely for crafting playing cards, Nintendo's first step into the world of video games was with the Odyssey.
The only real peripheral for it, to my knowledge anyway, was the gun. which was actually made by Nintendo, which is really weird to think about. And this thing did not have an orange tip on it. If you saw it and you didn't know better, you would think someone just had a rifle.
It was a light rifle. The rifle was being manufactured in Japan for little kids. They took this rifle, they retrofitted it with a light detector that you could plug into the joystick port. Even at the very beginning of the home video game console, we had a light gun with a game that you could play and shoot at your TV.
Although the Odyssey came with 6 packed-in game cartridges, throughout its lifespan, other games were released as well.
There were multiple add-on games that they come in a box. They come with that TV overlay. Most of them use the existing cartridges with different gameplay.
So also when it launched, it was $100, which 1972 was a good chunk of change. First year of the Magnavox Odyssey, I believe it was 69,000 units that sold. Someone named Nolan Bushnell, if you know who that is, from Atari, he visited an event for seeing the Magnavox Odyssey and the Pong type game being played.
He saw the new products that they were selling, and then shortly after, he came out with Pong. He knew he had something special. He put it into a local bar. A few days later, the bar owner called and said, "Hey, this thing's broken. It's not working." And he thought that was strange. So they went and looked at the game, and they opened it up, and it was full of quarters. You couldn't put any more money into it. So many people had been playing it. And Magnavox said, "Whoa, wait a second. Hey, what's going on here?"
In 1974, Magnavox filed lawsuits against multiple companies, including Atari, for infringement against the Odyssey. The suit was settled in 1976 when both Magnavox and Atari entered a cross-licensing agreement on video game technology.
And every time that someone, manufacturer would come out with a game console, they were paying royalties to Magnavox.
Magnavox Odyssey petered out around 1975. They quit supporting it, and by then they had sold 350,000 units.
They redesigned it for the Magnavox Odyssey 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 2000, 3000, 4000.
By the end of its life, Magnavox had sold a total of nearly 1.8 million units across the entire Odyssey brand.
Everyone else starts jumping on the bandwagon. I mean, 80s, oh my gosh. Fairchild Semiconductor, hey, let's make a game console. Connecticut Leather Company, Coleco, hey, let's make a console. The General Electronics, hey, let's make a console.
You bet your asteroid.
Everyone just kind of bam, 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 bam.
The last edition, the Odyssey 4000, you could lift up a joystick with a stick on it, and it was cabled to the console. They carried that over to the Odyssey 2, which was very much like the Atari 2600.
My name's Aaron Ishmael. I'm the owner of Vintage Geek, a museum and YouTube channel about vintage tech. And this is kind of a culmination of efforts to assemble a collection of vintage computers and technology from the late 70s through the early 2000s. The Odyssey 2 is a really interesting system. It's definitely more advanced than the Odyssey, the first Odyssey to come out. I think that Magnavox really wanted to outdo themselves when they came out with this second product in the product line. All right, let's give it a shot here. Oh no. The games were rudimentary, but there was some depth to a lot of the games for the system. They also had these really cool accessories for the system that we hadn't really seen with other systems. Like they had the voice module for it, which actually could make the system talk. At that time, I think it's cool now. I can't imagine what it would have been like, back in 1979 when they were developing this thing. The reason we got interested in the Odyssey 2 in particular is because not only was it from East Tennessee, but because it was heavily featured in the 1982 World's Fair. There's Pickaxe Pete. I actually was doing some research on the World's Fair itself. You know, it had some graphics of the Odyssey being the official video game of the World's Fair. There was an article about this contest for the fair where someone could win a pound of gold. I thought, is that real? I just think it's a really interesting concept that they tried back then, and it seems kind of ahead of their time. Obviously, a lot more things have happened since with Nintendo and other game systems and these big competitions, and I guess you could say that the World's Fair started it all. Hey, I made it through a door.
A chance of a lifetime. Sure, when's the last time you had an opportunity to win a pound of gold worth over $6,000? For the 5 finalists in Odyssey's Pickaxe Pete contest at the World's Fair, it was serious business. Before the match, some warmed up to help ease the tension, and then the race for gold began.
Get ready, get set, get picking.
Contestants were flown in from all over the country for the extravaganza. Yes, even Pickaxe Pete himself showed up to help. It was a close race, closer than many expected, but 10-year-old Tony Scardino came out on top. Do you have a style? Do you have a way that you go about doing this?
Yeah, all it is to do is get onto the left side of the screen on the top and just jump boulders, get the key, and go into the door.
However, once down away from the hustle and bustle of the crowds, the kid from Weehawken, New Jersey, got a chance to call home.
Hello, Ma? Yeah? I won.
It's kind of amazing to look back at the people that played these games in the tournament, for example, because I can only imagine how many hours they must have sat playing this game, repeating the same patterns over and over again to learn something and get truly good at it. The Odyssey, as well as a few other kind of pioneers in the video game space, really made modern gaming possible. The Odyssey obviously was the first to really encapsulate the idea of multiple game selection for your home kind of entertainment needs. It wasn't just Pong, for example, and that concept obviously has flourished. The Odyssey 2 definitely has a place in video game history, and I think it's really fun to look back and think of it as kind of the flagship of the World's Fair from 1982, because it just feels so 1982. Everything about it just, you know, encapsulates what it must have been like to be at the fair.
The World's Fair may have just been a temporary fixture in East Tennessee, but Jefferson City would see a much more permanent mark left by the Magnavox Odyssey. In July of 1982, the Jefferson County Commission approved an unnamed thoroughfare that ran alongside the Magnavox plant be named Odyssey Road. Soon after, however, the Jefferson City plant ceased production of the Odyssey when the company moved the line to Mexico. One Odyssey 2 game forever changed the way video games were viewed in a legal sense. Enter K.C. Munchkin, released ahead of the 1981 Christmas season. Shop owners were saying that K.C. Munchkin was fantastic, the hottest item going. One store owner said, "We had 65 to 70 K.C. Munchkin cartridges delivered last week, and they were gone in 2 days." In its first 2 months on the shelf, K.C. Munchkin sold more copies than any other Odyssey 2 game combined. K.C. Munchkin was a huge hit. But why? The year prior, Atari released the revolutionary Pac-Man into arcades. In its first year alone, the arcade cabinets gobbled up over 1 billion quarters. K.C. Munchkin traversed mazes and ate munchies, much like Pac-Man did ghosts. But despite their similarities, North American Philips Public Affairs Specialist Ed Williams said in a 1982 interview that, "We have avoided any reference to Pac-Man because it's not that. It might be considered our answer to Pac-Man, but it has enough unique differences to make it a success. The player has the ability to make his own mazes with K.C. Munchkin. There were other differences as well, such as disappearing walls and moving dots, but that didn't stop independent newspaper ads calling the game more challenging than Pac-Man, and that K.C. Munchkin plays like Pac-Man, the most popular arcade game of all time." Bally's Manufacturing, Pac-Man's distributor, viewed these similarities as copyright infringement and filed a lawsuit against Philips in 1981, alleging K.C. Munchkin was a clone of Pac-Man. The initial court ruling sided with Magnavox, citing the game's unique elements. However, Atari appealed, and in 1982, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit reversed the decision. The court's ruling stated that video games, unlike an artist's painting or other audiovisual works, appeal to an audience that is fairly undiscriminating, insofar as they are concerned about more subtle differences in artistic expression. A Philips Magnavox spokesperson in Knoxville, Tennessee, rebuked the court's decision, stating, "The K.C. Munchkin game is more interesting and challenging for the player. We take issue with the appeals court and are preparing an appeal for this decision to the Supreme Court." The Supreme Court refused to see the case, and as a result of the ruling, K.C. Munchkin was pulled from store shelves. This case set a precedent in video game copyright law, establishing that gameplay elements could be protected under copyright if the expression was similar enough. Philips Magnavox continued dabbling in video games into the third generation of consoles with their Europe-only release of the VideoPack G7400. This system would have been known as the Odyssey 3 Command Center in America, but it was never released stateside.
But after the Odyssey, the system that we found that I found pretty notable was the Philips CDI. And that system obviously was much later, but it was another kind of pioneer in the gaming industry in the sense that it kind of brought that multimedia experience home, where people could have, these discs that were CDs essentially, but that would have full motion video combined with actual gameplay. And there were obviously a number of systems kind of working toward that at the same time, but Philips did an admirable job of putting something together that was compelling.
Now get into CDI, starting at $2.99.
The CDI's lifespan lasted from 1990 to 1999 before being discontinued, marking the final game system in the Magnavox lineage. Ralph Baer would go on to be known as the father of video games. He was awarded the National Medal of Technology in 2006 before his death 8 years later. In 2019, his home state of New Hampshire forever memorialized him with the unveiling of a statue in his honor at Arms Park in Manchester. And in 2021, his contribution to the world of video games became part of the American Innovation Dollar Program, when the state coin of New Hampshire paid homage to the brown box.
And on the back, there's a little square, and it represents table tennis. That's a big honor when your state says this was significant and the inventor was from here. There are dozens and dozens of books that talk about the history of joysticks, the history of video games, video game consoles. And often the first thing I do is I look at the first chapter and I want to see if they even mentioned Odyssey.
The biggest problem is if you ask anyone, hey, what's the first video game? It's Pong. It's always Pong. If you up to anyone on the street, like, oh, do you know who Ralph Baer was? No idea. Another thing about just video game history in general is a lot of it was not really recorded. Everything was just business. You look at Magnavox. To them, okay, yeah, this looks cool, this is whatever, we're looking at, $100 a unit, we're going to sell it only at our dealerships, so on and so on. But it was a part number.
I think there's definitely a nostalgia factor, but I think more importantly, it's something that's tangible. It's physical touch. You can actually, push a button, turn a knob. You can watch a screen slowly come on and that kind of, glow and ambiance as the CRT, warms up. We don't have any of that with modern tech.
Even if you're not interested specifically in the Magnavox Odyssey, you can certainly appreciate where that led and how an entire industry now worth hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars that we have today.
It's just like anything else, as time marches on, the window for getting, more of what happened gets smaller and smaller and smaller. That is why I think, it is important, and that is why people should know about the Odyssey.
The Odyssey didn't just launch a product, it launched a culture. In its own quiet way, the Odyssey redefined how we engage with technology, making gameplay not just a pastime, but a platform for connection and exploration. Today's gamers may not know its name, but they feel the Odyssey's influence every time they press start.